Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday afternoon Zoom series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are most fortunate to host a dynamic duo of experts on interpersonal relationships, Linda and Charlie Bloom. They have recently published a very interesting book that I think all of you will be interested in getting. This is the book. It's called An End to Arguing: Important Lessons for All Types of Relationships. The Blooms are trained psychotherapists and relationship counselors. They have worked with individuals, couples, groups, and organizations since 1975. They have lectured and taught at learning institutes throughout the USA, including Esalen Institute, the California Institute of Integral Studies, the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, University of California, Berkeley Extension Program, the World Health Organization, and also in many countries around the world, including Sweden, Denmark, Brazil, Japan, China, and probably a host of other countries. So some of their other books, the one that they became famous for was the first one, 101 Things I Wish I Knew When I Got Married, which is a fascinating book. And I think all of them are still available. But today we're going to focus on An End to Arguing. So welcome, Charlie and Linda. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Well, you're certainly welcome. And for those of you who don't know, I've known Linda and Charlie at least 20 some years. And they used to live in Sonoma, and it's great to have you on this program. So I have a whole bunch of questions I could ask. I have them all written down, and I'm not sure where I'm going to jump around because knowing you so well and having read your books, I have kind of an overview of what you've been teaching us about. But I think I might want to jump into a place that is something I've noticed in the demographic that I live in and that a lot of Praxis members live in. And that is conflict avoidance. I think there's a tendency among some progressive liberals and New Agers who believe that conflicts don't exist if they don't acknowledge them. They can kind of bury it and just move on and it'll be gone. So I would like you to talk first about the dangers of paving over problems by not facing them and what the consequences can be when we don't deal honestly with conflicts that we have in our lives or in our relationships, and how that manifests. And then lastly, how we might overcome this tendency to bury conflicts because we don't like the hassle of them.
Thank you for the question. It's a really important question. And there are a lot of conflict phobic people around. And I am one of those people in the past. Thank goodness I'm recovered. And I will always be grateful to my beloved Charlie that early in our relationship, he wouldn't allow it. And I knew that it would be a deal breaker for him if I didn't work up some courage and speak up and be more direct. So the trick of the mind is that the problems will go away. They don't. They just lay there incomplete, like termites in a house eroding the foundation, and you can't really get away with having a great relationship, a trusting rapport, if you let those incompletions accumulate. And one of the things that I found is that people avoid conflict because they don't really trust themselves to bring the issue up in a respectful way. They're afraid that they're going to have retaliation and they're going to get into trouble. And if they learn how to be very respectful in their communication, to talk about why it is that this is so important to them, why they may be triggered and have a lot of emotion coming up, if they can talk about what's scary, or what's painful, it makes all the difference in the world. And another thing that makes a huge difference is when people become champions of repair. Do you know that there's going to be some breakdowns, but we need to become artful and masterful in how to correct, do a do-over. I had tone in my voice that was kind of sharp. Let me say that again in a more genteel way. And apology and forgiveness are so important and really important tools in the toolbox for repair. And once people start to trust that they can bring up the tough subjects in a respectful way, and they can repair if things break down, then they graduate out of being conflict phobic to be a validating relationship, which is of the highest order.
You know, you just mentioned apology, and I thought, you know, a lot of people fear apologizing because they fear that then the person's going to come at them. That makes them vulnerable, and they're going to be more attacked more. And can you say something about that?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, Georgia. And I think that the V word, vulnerable, is really at the heart of most of the difficulties that people, and we're not just talking about couples, we're talking about any interaction with a person with whom there may be differences where each one of you may have different agenda or different ways of dealing with it. And so when that issue is not managed, when the fear of vulnerability, which is really the fear of being hurt, being wounded, being judged, being in some way emotionally threatened, when that is not addressed or acknowledged, then defenses are going to show up, and we all have defenses. The problem with activating somebody's defenses, which happens when you're wanting to be right, when you're wanting to make a point, when you're wanting to get them to understand, when you're wanting them to somehow validate or agree with you in some way, when you bring that attitude into a conversation, which is hard to avoid doing when it's an important situation for you. But when you bring it, you're going to activate somebody else's defense. That's problematic is because when I'm feeling threatened and I'm getting defensive, which I can't help if I feel some kind of a threat, my ability to listen and receive what you're saying has diminished, often to the point where I can't even let it in. So one of the things that we're challenged to do in order to be able to maintain some kind of, or develop some kind of understanding with the other person, is to be able to work with our own reactivity that keeps us from being open to hearing their side of the story. Because if they don't feel heard, if they don't feel like we're getting the message, we're just going to stay stuck in that loop of each one of us trying to coerce the other one into, by whatever strategy we choose to use, but by trying to get them to understand us, to accommodate us, to agree with us. And when you have that cycle uninterrupted, then you have an argument. And when we say an end to arguing, we don't mean an end to differences. There's never going to be an end to differences. We're always going to have people in our life who, from time to time, have different perspectives. But we don't have to get into those painfully repetitive cycles that end with deep frustration, pain, anger, resentment. So our book is really, it's not just written for couples like some of our other books have been, but our book is how to interrupt that cycle so that there can be a breakthrough rather than a breakup or a breakdown.
Right. I wanted to ask one thing related to that, because very often people think that they've apologized when they say something like, I'm sorry that you feel that way.
It's not an apology.
Right. So I'd like you to just comment on that.
Take down.
It can be a bluff. It can be a dodge. It can be dancing around the real issue, which is taking
There's a problem.
full responsibility for the part that we played.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that a lot of people are too frightened to be honest, or too arrogant to be honest, that they have something to do with it. And it makes all the difference in the world when you can get out of the mindset of perpetrators and victims and start to see that those difficult interactions are made up of co-conspirators, and people bring their ways of communicating, which are not always so elegant, and they can activate other people. And then if we can be mindful and self-observe and honest and tell the truth that we're not always perfect and have fabulous communication and negotiation skills, we can take our part, which doesn't mean that the whole responsibility falls with us. There's usually joint responsibility when there's that kind of conflict. And it's not neat. It's not 50-50. It's 60-40 or 70-30 or 80-20, maybe it's 95-5. But it is powerful when we take our part and make a sincere apology for the part we played. And then resist the temptation to try to get the other person
Now
to
you
take
get,
the
now
part.
you got to fess up because I did it. Come on, let's hear it.
Just
Yeah.
do it because
I
it's
know.
the right thing to do,
Yeah.
to be responsible at a very high level.
Mhm.
You mentioned something just now that really interesting, that a lot of these disagreements are not 50-50 responsible.
Okay.
Both people aren't equally responsible often. And how do you look at that? How do you deal with that? If you know that there's an inequality of responsibility for a problem, what is the best way to deal with that?
Well, what has to happen is that each person has to somehow come to the point where they can acknowledge that their perspective here, in which they're holding the other person completely responsible for the breakdown, may not be accurate. That there's going to be some openness to seeing that they have played, that this is an interaction in which both people have played a part. And the whole question of, well, who's more responsible than the other? It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, like Linda said, whether it's 50-50 or 95-5.
Or who started it?
It doesn't make any difference.
You started.
Yeah.
So what?
What does matter, though, is that each person can see that their focus on the other person's contribution here is not going to help this become more resolved. That's not going to help. The only thing that's going to help is for you to work with the only person who you can influence in
That's
this
right.
in a positive way, and that is you.
Yeah.
That's the only way. And even if there's only a small part and you're blinded by all of the terrible things that this other person has done and said, it doesn't matter until you can find something that you may have done or said that contributed to being where you are now. And then you take responsibility for that and acknowledge it. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to apologize, but that you tell the truth to yourself and hopefully say to the other person, okay, I can see how you might feel that way. I can see that, what I did here, my best intention, but I can see how that could be a problem. And I just want to acknowledge that. Until you can redirect your focus from what the other person did wrong to what you can do that might improve things to yourself. And this is the challenge.
Yeah, this is the opposite of the way most of us grow up.
Opposite. It is the opposite.
It's taking responsibility for one's own part in these conflicts is something we have not been trained to do. And that was one thing I put into the blurb that I sent out was, we haven't had this kind of education, and yet it's critical in getting along in the world. And I want to ask you now, because the title of your book is how to end arguing. And so what are some of your points to end arguing? What are some bullet points for this process?
A very important point that we try to drive home is that when people have differences, really show up and pay attention, bring curiosity and wonder, bring an open mind. Try your best to aim for learning and understanding, different from agreement. You might never make it to agreement. Oh, well, you still can have a very important, substantive connection with the other person. But it requires being very alert, very awake, very self-disciplined to manage our reactivity, to find that point where we're getting so emotionally aroused, feeling threatened, so angry, irritated, resentful, that we're getting ready to go over the line from passion and intensity to coercion, to try to make the other person see it the way we see it.
The right way.
Do it the way we want them to do it. And that is a critical point. And when people take this work on, they start to pay attention to the signals in their body, when their chest is tight, when their jaw is clenched, when their belly's tight, when they may make a fist, when they want to run for the hills. And they start to see when they're getting very strongly emotionally aroused, they're likely to say something that is not skillful. And take a break, maybe just a breath or two, settle down, bring your heart rate down, that will help you to re-engage neocortex. Because when you get so flooded with feeling, only the reptilian brain is operative. It only knows fight, flight, and freeze. We want our creative part of our brain that has lots of possibilities and options to be available to us. So one of the chapters in the book is the most underutilized tool in the toolbox. And that's a timeout.
Yes, I saw that.
Maybe a few breaths isn't going to be enough. Maybe we're so emotionally overwrought that we have to leave the room for 20 minutes and come back and re-engage. And it's very important to re-engage. And when we take the break, it's very important how we take the break. You don't scowl at them as if you're impossible to deal with and stomp your feet as you're walking away and slam the door. You want to do it in a respectful way. I need a little time to think about this. I'm coming back. And that's a really important corrective tool that people can use, and they don't use it enough. So they either avoid the topic, sweep it under the rug, or else they get into an argument that's unnecessary and painful.
Yeah, you mentioned, this is interesting you brought that up, because you mentioned 10 forms of manipulation in your book. And I'd just like you to talk a little bit about them, because I think often we don't think of these actions as manipulative.
No, we certainly don't want to think of ourselves as being manipulators. Who, me? No, I wouldn't do that. But she is a real manipulator. I don't fall for it, though. Yeah, we only listed 10 because the other 50, we didn't make the chapter too long. Yeah, we have a lot of ways to manipulate. Sometimes we call it helping people. Sometimes we call it just being honest. Sometimes we don't recognize what makes a response manipulation is not what you're doing. It's what the intention is behind it. Whether there's some unspoken covert desire to influence this person in a way that's outside of their conscious awareness. And so there's something deceptive about it. And it's a way of avoiding vulnerability, which a person would be more likely to feel if they were to express what it is that their true intention really is in the situation. So yeah, I mean, manipulation could be, there's many different forms of it. And again, it's not the behavior itself. Sometimes when people cry, that is manipulation. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes when they're expressing anger and intimidating or trying to intimidate somebody, intimidation is a form of manipulation. Withdrawal, a refusal to engage, is a form of manipulation.
Well, there's so many people.
All that violence of silence.
Pardon?
Yeah. So I mean, we learn these, we develop these defensive maneuvers, in process of our history and growing up and observing other people, and we don't consider that we have a problem with manipulation. But when you really look at what manipulation is and how it can show up and how it's really about intention, not so much behavior, then, it's hard to miss that, well, maybe I can be guilty of that. Maybe I have been.
Yeah,
And it's
I think
important.
it's really good you spent a chapter on that and point these things out that we might not see. Another thing that you pointed out in the book that I think is really important to understand, I don't know that many people here would be doing it, but sometimes it's an automatic thing, as you mentioned in your book, that it was with you, Charlie, sarcasm and teasing.
Yeah.
A lot of people say, oh, well, that's just harmless. I'm just teasing the person.
Joking, yeah.
I've never felt teasing is in any way harmless. And so I'd be curious to get your take on both of those.
And you should speak about it.
Yeah, I'm an expert in sarcasm because I grew up in a family where sarcasm was the primary language that was spoken in the family. And so, of course, I grew up becoming really skilled at it and, mistakenly thinking that, oh, this is how everybody operates. Boy, was I wrong about that. And sarcasm, I totally agree with you. It is not harmless at all. The word, a lot of people don't understand that the root of the word sarcasm, it means the cutting of flesh. Sarcasm is cutting flesh. And that's what sarcasm can feel like when somebody uses that as a form of communication. And they can, the defense, of course, of the justification for it is to say, well, no, I was just kidding. Can't you take a joke?
Yeah.
And like in the family culture that I grew up in, yeah, there was some of that. So I wasn't all that sensitive to it. But for a lot of people, it hurts.
And I gave him a lot of feedback years ago and helped him to recover from that indulgence.
Yeah, I think it was probably more common with men than women, but anyone can actually do that. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because in your book, you have many real life stories of people that you've worked with, and they're fascinating and how they come to understanding what they're doing. And so I'd like you to maybe pick out one of your favorite stories that in the book that you would like to talk about and what is remarkable about it.
I will tell you that there is a sad story in the book about a man who completely shut his wife out when she tried to bring him feedback about things that did not work for her. He didn't shower enough. His body odor bothered her. He didn't brush his teeth enough. His mouth odor bothered. They were not having a good sexual relationship, and she was sad and disappointed about that. And when she would try to bring up the issues that needed attention, he'd say, you knew this about me when you married me, to try to shut her up. And she took it for a while. But the fact that she couldn't be heard about the things that really upset her, and she was part of the problem because she was talking herself into, oh, he's nice to the kids and he's a good provider and maybe my expectations are too high, but she couldn't talk herself out of it. And finally, she got to the point where she had to leave him. And it was because he refused to go to therapy and he refused to listen to her complaints. And she was responsible about the way she brought them to him. She wasn't critical and blamey. She was saying, this is difficult for me. But he was closed, and that finished them off.
Yeah, I remember that story, very poignant. And I know, Charlie, you have something to say about this.
Yeah, I think my favorite story in the book is one that I know that you are aware of because it took place with one of the speakers at one of our first conferences. Well, I think it was in 2007 that we invited Johan Galton as a speaker in Dubrovnik, and I had the pleasure, Linda and I had the pleasure of meeting with him a couple of years after his presentation, which we were both totally blown away by. I mean, it was like he is considered to be, for those of you who aren't aware of who he is, one of the most effective and skilled mediators in the world, has founded his own foundation and organization, and he's still doing it. And he
Yeah,
must
his
be like
90s.
90 now, in his 90s.
Yep.
And so we had the opportunity to meet with him when he came to San Francisco a couple of years later, and he told this story about something that he referred to. What did he call it? He referred to it as creative synthesis. And this was a situation that he was called in for a few years earlier. There was a border difference between the countries of Ecuador and Peru, 500 kilometers that separated their countries. It was divided by a river that, and you know, rivers have this tendency to change course. And so there had been for over 50 years this dispute about the boundaries. They couldn't make any headway on it. And what Johann offered to them was something that was very different than what they were talking about. They were trying to figure out who owns this side and where is the boundary. So he came up with something just outside of that polarized view of zero-sum thinking, you know, that it's got to be one way or the other. There's only two options, there's only two possibilities. And what he came up with was something in which there was no boundary, but there was just a shared space over the disputed territory that was binational. In other words, both countries were responsible for it, owned it, and there wasn't one or the other. And what they did was that they created a national park co-managed by both countries, in which people could come and they could picnic, they could mountain climb, they could swim, they could do all kinds of things, they could camp, and they could charge admission to it. And both countries would contribute to the maintenance of the park and contribute to the proceeds that came in. And that was his way of thinking outside the box. And that's really what we have to be willing to do, is to go beyond this very limited, distorted idea that there's only two options, my way or your way.
Or the highway.
Yeah, right. So, you know, I love that story.
Yeah,
because
it's a great story.
when we're working with groups or with individuals, we're always helping them to see, look, you're stuck in this polarizing, dualistic thinking, and you've got to get out of it. You've got to see that there's more than two possibilities here. And usually we're pretty successful in getting people to, even maybe begrudgingly, but they will admit, well, I suppose there could be something other than the way I see it here, you know, but they've got to get to that point. If they can't get to the point where they're at least questioning their perspective on how things are, then there's not a lot we can do to help them.
Yeah, Johann Galton calls that the both end strategy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Both end, and it's been highly effective, and for both personal and political
Absolutely. Yeah.
decisions. It's really, I mean, if our politicians could only work like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at wars all over the world, and the people who are kind of in charge of trying to do something about them don't ever see it this way. They're always saying, well, this country is going to win, or this country is going to win. And there isn't the sense of, let's negotiate and put an end to it. I mean, I'm thinking Ukraine, I'm thinking of a whole bunch of things that, you know, the news is to get us polarized and not to get us interested in negotiation. And I find that very, very disturbing, because we could end up in a nuclear war because of this inability on a political level. So anyway, I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that before I open it up to audience questions, but if you have anything else you want to say before I do that. That would be the
A lot
topic.
that we could say, but I would love to hear some questions because I want to make sure that before we're done, we do address other concerns that people might have.
Great. Okay, so I think people know how to raise their hands, and if you don't, you can always put it up like this. I see a hand went up somewhere, but now I don't know where it is. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, hi you guys.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you too. I have a number of questions, but I'll start with this one. I know you've worked in this way for many, many, many years around conflict and more connection. How do you see this transferring to a larger arena, as in the global mess we're in, given school shootings, war, violence, increase of hatred and dividedness? So how do you see this could be transferred to a larger arena?
Thank you for the question. You know, Charlie and I were in college way back in the 60s. It was a hotbed of sit-ins and marches and political action. And there was a very important slogan back then about the personal is the political. And I believe that when each person in their closest relationships is doing their utmost to grow into a terrific negotiator, to be articulate in expressing their needs and negotiating for them, when they learn how to speak respectfully, when they learn how to create a trusting bond, that if everybody, I'm talking at the grassroots, basic level, with their own children, with their own parents, with their own siblings, with the people on their job, with their bosses and their supervisors and the people that they supervise, that it has a spillover effect. And I'm not against people, you know, petitioning their Congress people that represent their views. But I think in addition to reaching up for the people in powerful positions to be doing the work, that we have the power to change our ways and to stop being avoidant and to learn how to speak with finesse and grace and style and create those kind of understanding conversations and bonds, and that we become each individual more powerful, each couple, each family unit, each community, and that will have an impact.
Okay, does someone else want to ask a question before we take Katie's next question? Well, maybe we'll take your next question, Katie.
I just want to add one thing
Okay.
to what Linda just said. She used the word negotiation.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we don't think, particularly in terms of personal relationships, we don't think in terms of, well, you know, we need to negotiate. That's just something you do in business. Well, you know, the word negotiate means, if you look it up in the dictionary, here's what it says. Here's one of the primary definitions of it. It's a form of communication in which both parties have the intention of coming to agreement. Okay. Now, the key word in that is both. When we get into the conflict and arguments, we're not concerned about the other person getting what they need fulfilled.
Yeah.
All we want to do is win.
Right.
I don't like the term win-win even, because, you know, the word win means, you know, to struggle, to fight, to dominate. That's what is implied in that word. So the transition from winning to mutual satisfaction, not that we're both going to get exactly what we want out of this negotiation, but we're both going to be sufficiently satisfied so that we can at least feel like we've made some movement towards appreciating or understanding the other person's perspective. It might take multiple conversations, to get to where we really want to get to. But at least for now, we're sufficiently satisfied to be okay with this situation.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I get it.
It was interesting, you mentioned that you don't like the term win-win, and I agree that it's not both end, and it's actually activating a certain way of looking at a disagreement.
Exactly.
And that's the problem, and I think you were pointing that out. A both end is a different way of looking at it. And when you mentioned earlier about intention being even more important than the behavior, this is where that comes in. The win-win is a certain kind of intentionality, different than both end. Yeah, so that's a good point. Anyone else before we let Katie continue? Okay, Linda.
I'm not sure exactly how to express this, but it's a little bit along the lines of what Katie asked. I'm in a group that I co-founded, and I'm curious, when you're in a group situation and the co-founders are having difficulties, and you want to resolve it because everyone's kind of confused in the group, because the leaders should be kind of attending to their own conflict, but they're not exactly doing that. So what advice can you give if you're one of the co-leaders and the other co-leader is, defensive, you're willing to be vulnerable, you're willing to bring it up in the group so that the group can kind of look at it on the table and kind of, deal with it together, because really everybody has to kind of agree to move forward, at least in the group I'm in. I guess that the maybe the bottom line question is there a time when you just say, I can't deal with this anymore, and so you just kind of go your way, your separate way? I mean, when do you give up?
There is a time, and often people give up prematurely when they haven't explored all the options and turned over all the rocks. There's a chapter in the book, and I think it is one of the most important chapters in the book, that's entitled Enlightened Self-Interest. And when people don't want to talk about it and they're avoidant, and they throw up the shield and distract, and we need to be as capable as we can in appealing, because everybody's motivated by self-interest, to appeal to them that they must have had a vision for this group. Maybe it's not manifesting. If we can invite them to say, what was your original intention about involving yourself in this group? Do you have ideas? Lots of questions. Do you have ideas about what would be more useful? What would be more effective? What would lead to success? Now, you may have tried all of these things. And if you have tried and you have made a valiant effort and you're still hitting the wall, there does come to a point, every great warrior knows when it's time to surrender. But it's important to not leave prematurely until you are satisfied, and you won't be haunted by the if onlys, I had tried this or that or the other thing. You give it your best shot, and some people are stubborn and closed and frightened and only think about perpetrators and victims and are arrogant. And there are definitely people like that, and they don't want to grow and they're fixed in their ways. But give it your best.
Thank you. That's
It's good advice.
I typically am a headbanger till, finally.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that none of that is in reference to me.
Good luck with that one.
Well, that brings us up to boundaries too. Having healthy boundaries about what is tolerable. Well, maybe that's the wrong word, tolerable, but I think what Linda brought up is the kind of relationship this is sort of in a group or an organization. And I've certainly run up against this a lot in different organizations I've been in over the years. Well, there'll be someone who just will either sabotage the group in some way, and there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, no matter how hard you or other people try, they're always going to be the one that kind of sabotages what a plan is going forward, or prevent plans from going forward. So I think we didn't mention it earlier, but I think boundaries are really important for us to consider. And I want to know if you, Charlie or Linda, have anything you'd like to say about that.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to an issue that you mentioned earlier, Georgia, about conflict avoidance and phobia, where people often out of that phobia, they do not communicate and behave with respect to effective boundaries for them. And when we say boundaries, we're not just talking about like physical space, but we're talking about the way in which people communicate with them and how they respond to reactions from others that are hurtful or potentially harming and distressing to them, because of fear of putting down a boundary could further activate this person's hostility or aggression towards me. And you know, a lot of us, many of us, maybe most of us, have had experiences where when we did try to communicate an unwillingness to accept something from somebody that felt disrespectful, they just amped up their reactivity and their judgments and their attacks or whatever, and, you know, made it worse. So, you know, a lot of us are very disinclined to assert boundaries out of the fear that could just make it worse. So I'll just shut up and I won't say anything. But of course, you know, as you pointed out earlier, there are prices that we pay for that. There are prices that affects the relationship, that affects the trust, that affects a lot of things. And when we don't deal with something that is having that kind of an impact on us, it doesn't just disappear. It goes underground and it erodes the foundation of trust and respect in the relationship.
Yes. So does anyone else have anything? Otherwise, I will go back to Katie, because I know she's got probably lots. Go ahead, Katie. Do you have anything? Oh, Gina, let me go to Gina. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of along these lines, but I was just thinking of the control freak situation, dealing with something, and there was this is not a person who's going to negotiate, and they believe they have all the control. They don't recognize the destruction that they create because of it. And then you have to just work around that person or just walk away. So that, you know, it's that personality type. I mean, I happen to be familiar with this organization that has very high turnover because of this individual and the way they manage the organization. But it's like, you know, it is what it is. He's not going to change the style that he's had. And there's not, there's denial is part about the damage that's caused. And then that's when you get to the point you go, okay, minds are made up here. There's nothing else you can do about it.
There's control freaks and they're control freaks.
There's a chapter in our book, and the title of the chapter is Control Freaks.
Right.
Read the chapter. That'll answer your question.
Some of them are so run by their fears, most of it unconscious, that they're closed, stubborn, haughty, talk down to other people, don't listen, and they're not motivated to learn and grow at all. There are other people who have a tendency to be controlling, who have a little bit more wiggle room. And for those of us who need to associate with them because we're working on projects with them at work or in some other volunteer activities, that to the degree that we can put them more at ease so that their fears aren't so activated and driving them. And one of the things that was really helpful for me was when I learned this phrase of scratch a tyrant and you find a coward.
Find what?
Scratch a tyrant and you find a coward. That when people are tyrannical and they're bullying and they're controlling and they're manipulative and they're obnoxious and crazy makers, do you know that those people are unconscious to how they're bruising other people around them, frightening other people around them, alienating people around them, and working against their own self-interest to accomplish their goals because other people don't want to play team with them because they're so hard to get along with. And so I think it's important to ascertain whether there's any room there to be able to get a little closer to them. Usually they alienate everybody, but sometimes if you can have some kind of rapport with them, there is a little wiggle room. We're talking limited goals here.
And I may know who she's talking about, and it might mean taking someone who doesn't know this person so well to make those overtures because of the alienation that may have happened
Yeah.
with a lot of the other people involved. So I will go back to you, Katie, at this point.
Yeah, I have two more questions. One could probably be somewhat brief, but what I'm finding is that a lot of people actually who even teach conflict resolution, who are liberals, who espouse this kind of a thing, who understand that all of this matters a lot, are generally often people that are not able to be vulnerable. And I am finding that it becomes they are often even blamers, and it's always a surprise to me to find a facilitator or a speaker or an author or, a therapist who is a blamer and is not capable of, or apparently not demonstrating any vulnerability. Any reflections on that?
That's a good one.
The word that I was struck by, Katie, in your description was able. Are they really unable to be vulnerable? Are you sure about that? Because I don't think it's, in the vast majority of cases, I don't think it's the inability to be vulnerable. I think it's the unwillingness to risk vulnerability. And, we all have our reasons for being defensive. Defensiveness is just a way of avoiding being vulnerable. The word vulnerable means to be at risk of experiencing harm or pain.
That's right.
So there's an unwillingness there. And seeing them as unable, really, the problem with that is that it does not acknowledge the responsibility that they have, which means that when they deny responsibility by implying that they're not able to, then they deny themselves the power to do anything about it. If I'm convinced that I am not able to tell the truth, that I am not able to keep my commitments, that I'm not able to drop my defenses, then I have a perfect excuse to continue my pattern. And if nobody is, if when people try to enlighten me or try to persuade me to see that maybe I do have some power here, maybe I'm not a total victim. If my reaction to that is to just invalidate what they're saying or justify myself, then I'm not going to be getting any feedback from any people. Are just going to say, why bother even talking to this guy?
Yeah.
He's a lost cause. He's not get it. And so, move on,
I have something that I want to add to what Charlie said. I believe in that old adage about we teach what we need to learn.
Yeah.
And the people who are teaching this are interested, passionately interested in the subject because their way of dealing with difference has been such a problem for them for so many years. It was clearly why it became a specialty for us, because we're a couple of recovered hotheads. We're both the firstborn. You know, we were used to having things our way. And we both came from families that were not very highly emotionally intelligent and skillful in dealing with their differences. So they had the same arguments over and over and over, Groundhog, Day. So we were motivated because we paid attention to how much.
Well, we also knew that if we didn't get a grip on this, we'd be out of business.
Yeah, that's true too. But we saw how much pain it caused. How we would have these rip-roaring fights, and when we were young, we pulled all-nighters fighting. Neither one of us would back down, and we were so unskillful, and we manipulated in so many ways. We did so many things wrong.
Especially you.
But but we're good students. It's a signature strength of both of us that we learn, and we have sacred vows about growth. And we did pay attention and we learned a lot. And so I feel that we're still learning, and we got such good help from so many people that I feel compelled to pay it forward. That's why we try to distill all this that we learned down to essence and put it in a reader-friendly book so that people would. We're trying to save people some trouble.
Right. I think what's one of the things that's so remarkable about the book and useful about the book is the chapters are short and they get right to the point.
Yeah.
There's no there's no filler. It's all real stuff.
I really appreciate that. You appreciate that.
Yes.
I don't know if anybody listening here has noticed, but the average attention span has diminished to the point where you can barely write a complete sentence without people losing interest in it. So short chapters are definitely the way to go.
Yes, and it really keeps your attention. So I think that was a very smart move. I see that Linda has her hand up again, and that's probably the last question we'll take. Go ahead, Linda.
Well, related to my previous question, when you're dealing with conflict in a group setting, where this is a very horizontal, very participatory group. We don't really have big hierarchy here, but two of us kind of founded it. We've been making decisions for the rest of the group, and suddenly, we're not in agreement. What advice do you have or wisdom around how do you, like when you finally just get, okay, the person I've been dealing with is just locked into his defensiveness. He's not going to be vulnerable. He's not going to put his cards on the table. How does one move forward in a collective situation as a co-leader in that kind of setting? I'd love some advice there, because, I mean, other people are going to have to go with me, or they're going to have to go with him. And I hate to see, it's like a divorce in a family. It's horrible. It's just horrible.
It may have to go that way. There isn't always a good solution. Sometimes we have to look at what the options are and take the better of the not so hot solutions. And I don't know whether it's a possibility that you, with your way, could be in charge, and you take the leadership role in some meetings, and you ask if he would agree to step back and to be respectful of your style. And you're not asking for anything that you wouldn't be willing to do, that you would step back and let him do it in his way. Maybe you don't approve, but in the spirit of fairness, this would be like Peru and Ecuador. That it's outside the box, that you two don't try to co-lead anymore. If it's too aggravating and it's costing you too much, maybe you have to divide. The Protestants church have the Baptists and the and the other denominations because they just couldn't be together, and maybe there has to be division, but maybe there's some other way that could be better than trying to do the same old that's aggravating the hell out of you.
Thank you for that. I kind of have decided we have to kind of carve out our own little boundary of what we're trying to do and not get into each other's thing. Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
I'd like to talk to you about that, Linda. I'd be very interested if you're into it.
That's good individuation. And nobody's wrong, just different.
Thank you.
Very interested in that. So Linda and Charlie, any last words from you before we end the recording and the session today?
Found this valuable, and I could tell there was a lot of juice here. I want to encourage people to go to our website. On the home page, you go down to the bottom and you click YouTube, and it will take you to become a YouTube subscriber, because we've got a ton of free stuff on our website. So we've been doing promotion for months. And so there's a whole lot of wonderful interviews, and you get the whole interview on YouTube. If you want the little ones, Instagram's got the small pieces, but it's all there. And so you can buy the book. It'll really serve you. You may want to gift it to some people. Yes. They could benefit from it who are open. We've got over 600 blogs on Psychology Today, where we got over 10 million hits. We have free ebooks, and you can sign up for our newsletter and get a booster shot of inspiration once a month. So if you go visit our website, particularly if you become a YouTube subscriber, you can get more stimulation for how to be creative with the people that you deal with, some of which, you know, can tax us.
Yeah, and I think John put your website in the chat box.
Oh, good.
Good.
Yeah, so people can access that. And I saved the chat, so I will send that out with the recording later tonight. And we also have a YouTube channel, and would love to have people to subscribe to the Praxis YouTube channel as well. So we're all we have a lot of free things up there too that we.
Good. Charlie, did you have some closing remarks too?
No,
No.
I do. I was kidding, but a little shorter than Linda's. I just want to thank everybody for tuning in and being a part of this, and for your attention, for your questions, for your engagement, because I could feel it.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate that, because these things are a lot more fun when there are other people besides us doing it. So I really appreciate your joining us, and encourage you to try some of the things that we talked about here. You know,
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
It's never finished.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Linda and Charlie. It's been great having you here today. And thank you, other people, for your questions as well, which I think really filled this out in a wonderful way. So thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.